In this video, we'll explore the concept of moral relativism and its implications for our understanding of morality. Moral relativism is a philosophical position that challenges the idea of objective moral truths, asserting that moral judgments are subjective and vary across cultures and individuals. It raises important questions about the nature of morality and the diversity of moral perspectives. Howdy. I'm just some random nude dude sitting in my closet talking to myself. It's also where I celebrate the power of free thinking and encourage bold ideas. As a society, we're often afraid to challenge the norms and think outside the box. But here, I embrace the unconventional. So sit back, relax, and join me on this journey of exploration, where we embrace our inner nude dude and push boundaries to discover new perspectives. Before we begin, I'd like to shout out and thank Frodo Jr. MLG 653 for this topic idea. Let's see if I've got this graphic thing going. I've got this new graphic program, and I think it's really, really mind-blowing. Here we go. Yeah, I think I nailed that. So welcome to our thought-provoking discussion on moral relativism. Today, we embark on the exploration of the concept of moral relativism and its implications for our understanding of morality. Moral relativism is a philosophical position that challenges the notion of objective moral truths. It posits that moral judgments are subjective and vary across cultures and individuals. This perspective prompts us to question whether there are universal standards that determine what is morally right or wrong. In our journey through moral relativism, we'll delve into the arguments presented both in favor of and against this philosophical stance. On the one hand, proponents of moral relativism argue that it promotes tolerance, respect for cultural diversity, and recognizes the complexities of moral beliefs. They contend that moral judgments are shaped by the cultural, historical, and individual contexts in which they arise. On the other hand, critics raise concerns about moral relativism. They argue that it poses challenges to the idea of moral progress and the evaluation of moral actions. Critics also question whether moral relativism can provide a coherent framework for moral discourse and decision-making. These debates challenge us to critically examine the foundations of our moral beliefs and consider the implications of moral relativism on ethical reasoning. Throughout our discussion, we'll also explore the logical consistency of moral relativism. Some critics argue that moral relativism falls prey to self-refutation by asserting a universal claim about the subjective nature of morality. We'll analyze this argument and evaluate the coherence of moral reasoning within a relativistic framework. By delving into the depths of moral relativism, we hope to foster a deeper understanding of different ethical perspectives and encourage critical thinking about the nature of morality. Join us as we navigate this captivating topic, provoking thoughtful reflection on the complexities of moral philosophy. Moral relativism is a philosophical standpoint that challenges the existence of objective moral truths. It posits that moral judgments are subjective and vary across cultures and individuals. In other words, there are no universally valid moral principles that apply to all people, cultures, or situations. Instead, moral relativism suggests that what is considered morally right or wrong is contingent upon the perspectives, beliefs, values, and norms of particular cultures or individuals. At the heart of moral relativism is the rejection of the notion of absolute or universal moral standards. According to moral relativism, moral judgments are not grounded in some objective or transcendent moral reality, but are rather constructed by human beings in their social and cultural contexts. As a result, what is considered morally acceptable or unacceptable can vary significantly between cultural, historical, and individual perspectives. Moral relativism acknowledges that moral judgments are influenced by cultural, historical, and individual factors. Cultural relativism, a specific form of moral relativism, emphasizes the impact of cultural norms and values on moral standards. It recognizes that different cultures develop their own moral frameworks, shaped by their unique histories, traditions, customs, and social structures. Thus, cultural relativism suggests that moral values and principles are relative to the specific cultural context in which they emerge. It's important to note that moral relativism does not imply a complete abandonment of moral judgment or moral discourse. While it recognizes the subjectivity of moral judgments, it does not necessarily advocate for moral relativism as a form of moral nihilism or moral skepticism. Rather, moral relativism acknowledges that moral beliefs and practices can be evaluated and discussed within specific cultural or individual frameworks. It allows for the examination of moral diversity, encourages critical analysis of moral beliefs, and fosters a deeper understanding of the influences that shape our ethical perspectives. By understanding the definition and nature of moral relativism, we gain insights into the core principles and its departure from the concept of objective moral truths. This understanding provides a foundation for exploring the arguments for and against moral relativism and evaluating its logical consistency in ethical discourse. Moral relativism recognizes that moral judgments are influenced by various factors, including culture, history, and individual perspectives. These factors shape our moral beliefs and values, contributing to the diversity of moral perspectives across different societies and individuals. Culture plays a significant role in shaping moral standards and judgments. Each culture develops its own moral framework, which reflects its shared beliefs, values, traditions, and social norms. Cultural norms and practices shape individual understanding of right and wrong, influencing their moral judgments. For example, cultural attitudes towards topics such as marriage, family, and social hierarchies can greatly impact moral viewpoints within a particular culture. Cultural relativism, a specific aspect of moral relativism, emphasizes the influence of cultural context on moral standards. It suggests that moral values and principles are relative to the specific cultural context in which they emerge. Different cultures may have distinct moral frameworks, reflecting their unique historical experiences, geographical locations, religious beliefs, and societal structures. Historical events and experiences also shape moral perspectives. Historical contexts can shape society's collective memories and cultural narratives, which in turn influence their moral judgments. For instance, the experience of war, colonization, or social movements can deeply impact a society's moral outlook and shape its moral responses to similar situations in the future. Historical events and cultural traumas can shape societal norms and values, leading to differences in moral perspectives across different historical periods. Individuals' personal experiences, upbringing, education, and personal values can influence their moral judgments. While cultural and historical factors provide a broader framework for moral beliefs, individuals interpret and internalize these influences in unique ways. Each person has their own set of values, ethical principles, and life experiences that shape their moral reasoning. As a result, even within a specific culture or historical context, there can be a variation in individual moral perspectives. The influence of culture, history, and individual perspectives on moral judgments highlights the dynamic and context-dependent nature of morality. It underscores the idea that what is considered morally right or wrong can vary across different cultures and individuals. Understanding these influences helps us appreciate the complexity of moral diversity and encourages us to critically examine our own moral beliefs and biases. By recognizing the influence of culture, history, and individual perspectives, moral relativism can provide a framework for understanding the contextual nature of moral judgments and highlights the need for open-mindedness and cultural sensitivity in ethical discussions. Cultural relativism is a specific form of moral relativism that places emphasis on the influence of cultural context on moral standards and judgments. It suggests that moral values and principles are relative to the specific cultural context in which they emerge. Cultural relativism recognizes the diversity of moral frameworks across different societies and emphasizes that no culture's moral framework is inherently superior to others. Cultural relativism acknowledges that different cultures have their own distinct sets of moral norms and practices. These norms and practices reflect the shared beliefs, values, traditions, and customs of a particular culture. For example, what may be considered morally acceptable in one culture may be seen as morally unacceptable in another. Cultural relativism acknowledges that different cultures have their own distinct sets of moral norms and practices. These norms and practices reflect the shared beliefs, values, traditions, and customs of a particular culture. For example, what may be considered morally acceptable in one culture may be seen as morally unacceptable in another. Cultural relativism encourages us to understand and respect these cultural variations, avoiding ethnocentrism and the assumption that one's own cultural moral standards are universally applicable. Cultural relativism emphasizes that moral judgments should be understood within the specific cultural context from which they arise. It recognizes that individuals within a culture are shaped by their cultural surroundings, and their moral judgments are influenced by the prevailing moral values and norms of that culture. Cultural relativism suggests that moral judgments should not be evaluated solely on external or universal standards, but rather should be examined in light of the cultural framework in which they occur. Cultural relativism promotes tolerance and understanding of different cultural perspectives on morality. It recognizes that diverse cultures have developed their own unique moral frameworks based on their histories, traditions, religion, and social structures. By appreciating these cultural variations, cultural relativism fosters a spirit of open-mindedness, respect, and acceptance towards different moral viewpoints. It encourages individuals to step outside their own cultural biases and critically engage with alternative moral perspectives. It's important to note that cultural relativism does not imply moral relativism in an absolute sense. It does not argue that all cultural practices or moral judgments are equally valid or morally justifiable. Rather, cultural relativism highlights the significance of understanding moral judgments within their cultural context and encourages dialogue and cross-cultural understanding in ethical discussions. Cultural relativism serves as a reminder that moral judgments are deeply influenced by cultural factors, and that understanding diverse cultural perspectives can enrich our understanding of morality. By appreciating the complexities of cultural relativism, we can approach moral discussions with sensitivity and a willingness to engage with different viewpoints. One of the key aspects of moral relativism is the promotion of tolerance and respect for different cultural values and beliefs. It encourages an appreciation for the diversity of moral perspectives that exist across different societies and individuals. This appreciation of diverse moral perspectives fosters a broader understanding of the complexities of morality and encourages open-mindedness in ethical discussions. Moral relativism recognizes that different cultures have developed their own unique moral frameworks based on their histories, traditions, religions, and social structures. It acknowledges that moral values and principles can vary significantly across cultures. By recognizing this diversity, moral relativism promotes an understanding that what might be considered morally right or wrong in one culture may not be universally applicable to all cultures. This recognition helps us move beyond ethnocentrism and appreciate the richness and complexity of cultural differences. Ethnocentrism refers to the tendency to evaluate other cultures according to the standards and values of one's own culture. Moral relativism challenges ethnocentric perspectives by urging us to suspend our own cultural biases and engage with different moral viewpoints without immediately dismissing them as inferior or wrong. This mindset of cultural humility allows us a more nuanced understanding of diverse moral perspectives and encourages empathy and respect for cultural differences. Moral relativism encourages cross-cultural dialogue and understanding as a means to broaden our moral horizons. Engaging in respectful conversations and discussions with individuals from different cultures allows us to gain insights into their unique moral values, beliefs, and reasoning processes. Through these interactions, we can develop a deeper appreciation for the diverse ways in which societies grapple with moral questions and navigate ethical challenges. Appreciating diverse moral perspectives opens up opportunities for personal growth and learning. It allows us to question and critically reflect on our own moral beliefs and values. By engaging with alternative moral viewpoints, we can broaden our understanding of ethical issues, challenge our assumptions, and refine our own moral reasoning. This intellectual growth enables us to develop a more nuanced and informed approach to ethical decision-making. By fostering an appreciation of diverse moral perspectives, moral relativism promotes tolerance, empathy, and cultural sensitivity. It encourages us to step outside our own cultural bubbles, engage with different viewpoints, and strive for a deeper understanding of the complexities of morality. Through this appreciation, we can cultivate a more inclusive and respectful approach to ethical discussions and build bridges of understanding across cultures. While moral relativism acknowledges the subjectivity of moral judgments, it does not imply that all moral perspectives are equally valid or morally justifiable. Instead, it recognizes that moral judgments are shaped by cultural, historical, and individual factors. This understanding of the subjectivity of moral judgments prompts us to critically examine the influences that shape our ethical perspectives. Moral relativism recognizes that cultural and historical contexts play a significant role in shaping moral judgments. Cultural norms, values, traditions, and social structures influence how individuals within a culture perceive and evaluate moral issues. Likewise, historical events and experiences can shape society's collective memories and cultural narratives, which in turn impact their moral perspectives. Understanding the influence of culture and history help us appreciate the contextual nature of moral judgments. In addition to cultural and historical influences, individual perspectives contribute to the subjectivity of moral judgments. Each person has their own set of values, ethical principles, and life experiences that shape their moral reasoning. While cultural and historical factors provide a broader framework for moral beliefs, individuals interpret and internalize these influences in unique ways. Consequently, even within a specific culture or historical context, there can be variation in individual moral perspectives. Recognizing the subjectivity of moral judgments encourages us to engage in critical analysis of our own moral beliefs and biases. It prompts us to question the foundations of our moral values and evaluate whether they are based on sound reasoning or influenced by cultural conditioning. This critical examination helps us develop a more nuanced understanding of our own moral perspectives and enables us to engage in more thoughtful ethical decision-making. Moral relativism does not imply that all moral perspectives are equally valid or morally acceptable. Rather, it suggests that moral judgment should be understood within specific cultural and historical contexts. This recognition allows for meaningful evaluation and discussion of moral beliefs and practices, considering the underlying values, consequences, and reasoning employed. It encourages us to engage in ethical discourse, comparing and contrasting different moral viewpoints to foster intellectual growth and refine our moral reasoning. By acknowledging the subjectivity of moral judgments, moral relativism prompts us to critically reflect on the factors that influence our ethical perspectives. It encourages us to question the cultural, historical, and individual influences of our moral beliefs, fostering a deeper understanding of the complexities of morality. This critical self-reflection enables us to approach moral discussions with humility, open-mindedness, and a willingness to learn from diverse perspectives. By understanding the nature of moral relativism and its recognition of the role of culture and individual perspectives, we gain insights into the complexity of moral diversity. This understanding sets the foundation for exploring the arguments for and against moral relativism and evaluating its logical consistency. Moral relativism has been the subject of intense debate in philosophical discourse. Proponents argue that moral relativism offers valuable insights into the nature of morality and provides a framework for understanding ethical diversity. Critics, however, raise concerns about the implications of moral relativism and challenge its logical consistency. Let's explore the main arguments put forth both in favor of and against moral relativism. One of the key arguments in favor of moral relativism is the promotion of tolerance, respect, and appreciation for different moral perspectives. Moral relativism recognizes the existence of diverse cultures and acknowledges that each culture develops its own unique moral framework based on its history, traditions, values, and social norms. Here are some of the points that proponents of moral relativism make regarding tolerance and cultural diversity. Moral relativism emphasizes the importance of respecting the autonomy and self-determination of different cultures. It acknowledges that cultural norms and values play a critical role in shaping moral judgments within a particular society. By recognizing and appreciating cultural diversity, moral relativism discourages the imposition of one's own moral standards on other cultures. It encourages a stance of cultural humility, fostering a deeper understanding of different moral viewpoints and avoiding ethnocentrism. Moral relativism challenges preconceived notions and stereotypes about different cultures. It encourages individuals to go beyond surface-level judgments and delve into the underlying cultural, historical, and social factors that shape moral beliefs. By engaging with diverse moral perspectives, moral relativism promotes empathy and a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of morality. By acknowledging the existence of diverse moral perspectives, moral relativism facilitates cross-cultural understanding. It encourages individuals to engage in respectful conversation and dialogues with people from different cultures, fostering opportunities for learning, growth, and mutual enrichment. Through open-mindedness and cultural sensitivity, moral relativism encourages individuals to approach ethical discussions with curiosity, seeking to understand rather than to judge. Ethnocentrism refers to the tendency to evaluate other cultures according to the standards and values of one's own culture. Moral relativism challenges this ethnocentric perspective by urging individuals to suspend their own cultural biases and adopt a more open-minded and culturally sensitive approach. This helps us break down barriers between cultures, fostering greater tolerance, acceptance, and appreciation for moral viewpoints. Moral relativism recognizes that engaging in dialogue and collaboration with individuals from diverse cultures leads to a more inclusive and comprehensive understanding of morality. By actively seeking out and listening to different moral perspectives, individuals can broaden their horizons and challenge their own assumptions. This open exchange of ideas helps cultivate an environment where diverse moral viewpoints are valued and considered. Through the lens of moral relativism, the promotion of tolerance and cultural diversity becomes essential for fostering cross-cultural understanding and harmonious coexistence. By embracing the richness and cultural variations of moral beliefs, individuals can develop a more inclusive and compassionate approach to ethical discussions, facilitating mutual respect and appreciation for the diverse tapestry of human morality. Moral relativism challenges the notion of absolute moral truths and emphasizes the contextual nature of moral judgments. Proponents of moral relativism argue that this contextual flexibility allows for a more nuanced understanding of ethical issues. Here are some points that proponents of moral relativism make regarding contextual flexibility. Moral relativism acknowledges that moral judgments must take into account the specific cultural, historical, and individual contexts in which they arise. It recognizes that ethical issues often involve complex factors and multiple perspectives. Contextual flexibility allows for a deeper examination of the circumstances surrounding moral dilemmas and helps individuals consider the unique factors that shape ethical decision-making in different situations. Contextual flexibility enables moral judgments to adapt to diverse cultural settings. Different cultures have their own values, customs, and traditions that influence moral standards. By considering the cultural context, moral relativism allows for a more nuanced understanding of what may be considered morally acceptable or unacceptable in a particular culture. It recognizes that what may be deemed morally right in one culture may not necessarily apply universally to all cultures. Contextual flexibility encourages individuals to consider the consequences and intentions behind moral actions. It recognizes that moral judgment should take into account the specific outcomes and intentions of an action within its particular context. This approach allows for a more comprehensive assessment of moral situations, recognizing that the morality of an action may vary depending on the circumstances and intentions of the actor. By embracing contextual flexibility, moral relativism promotes a pragmatic approach to ethical decision-making. It recognizes that ethical dilemmas often involve navigating competing interests and conflicting values. The ability to adapt moral judgments to different contexts allows individuals to weigh the circumstances, values, and consequences involved in making ethically informed decisions. Contextual flexibility allows for cross-cultural learning and intellectual growth. By appreciating the diverse moral perspectives that arise from different contexts, individuals can gain insights into alternative moral viewpoints and expand their own understanding of morality. This fosters a dynamic and evolving ethical outlook, promoting personal development and a refinement of moral reasoning. Through the lens of moral relativism, contextual flexibility provides a framework for navigating the complexities of ethical dilemmas. By recognizing the importance of context, individuals can develop a more nuanced and adaptable approach to ethical decision-making, one that takes into account the diversity of cultural perspectives and the specific circumstances at hand. This flexible perspective helps individuals navigate the intricate moral landscape in a way that is attuned to the nuances of each unique situation. Critics of moral relativism often raise concerns about its implications for moral progress. They argue that without a belief in objective moral standards, moral relativism hinders the ability to evaluate moral advancements and condemn moral atrocities. Here are some points that critics make regarding the problem of moral progress. Critics contend that moral relativism lacks an objective standard against which moral progress can be measured. In the absence of a universal moral truth, there is no basis for determining whether moral advancements have been made or whether certain moral beliefs and practices are morally better or worse than others. Without an objective standard, it becomes challenging to assess moral growth of societies over time. The lack of objective moral standards can lead to moral skepticism, the belief that moral judgments are arbitrary and devoid of any objective meaning. Critics argue that moral relativism erodes the belief in any kind of moral truth or moral improvement. This skepticism can undermine the motivation to strive for moral progress, as there is no ultimate benchmark to guide ethical development. Moral relativism presents challenges in evaluating moral atrocities or morally reprehensible actions. Without a universal moral standard, it becomes difficult to make an objective judgment about acts such as genocide, slavery, or human rights violations. Critics argue that moral relativism may hinder the condemnation of such atrocities, as moral judgments are viewed as relative to the culture or individual perspectives that condone or accept them. Some critics contend that moral relativism can lead to moral indifference or complacency. The belief that all moral perspectives are equally valid may create a moral vacuum in which individuals are less inclined to take a stand on moral issues or to advocate for moral improvements. This concern arises from the belief that moral relativism fails to provide a sense of moral urgency or moral imperative to address injustices and promote positive change. Critics of moral relativism argue that the absence of moral objective standards poses challenges in evaluating moral progress and condemning moral atrocities. They suggest that a belief in objective moral principles is necessary to provide a coherent framework for addressing moral advancements and encouraging individuals and societies to strive for moral improvement. The problem of moral progress raises important questions about the role of objective standards in evaluating ethical development and the potential consequences of moral relativism on the pursuit of a more just and morally enlightened society. One of the main criticisms of moral relativism is its impact on moral discourse and decision-making. Critics argue that if moral judgments are purely subjective and relative, it becomes difficult to engage in meaningful discussions about ethical issues. Here are some points that critics make regarding the challenges of moral discourse. Moral relativism challenges the idea of shared moral standards or objective criteria for evaluating moral judgments. Without a common framework, it becomes challenging to engage in productive moral discourse and reach consensus on ethical matters. Critics argue that without a foundation of objective moral principles, moral discussions can descend into a clash of subjective opinions without a means of resolving moral disagreements. In a moral relativistic framework, where moral judgments are seen as purely subjective, individuals may be reluctant to critique or question the moral beliefs of others. The fear of being seen as judgmental or culturally insensitive can stifle meaningful ethical discussions. Critics argue that this reluctance can hinder the exploration and evaluation of moral beliefs and practices, limiting the potential for moral growth and improvement. Critics of moral relativism raise concerns about the potential for moral nihilism and moral indeterminacy. The rejection of objective moral truths can lead to the belief that moral judgments lack any inherent meaning or value. In the absence of objective standards, it becomes challenging to distinguish between morally right and wrong actions, resulting in a sense of moral indeterminacy. Critics argue that this undermines the purpose and value of moral discourse, as it becomes difficult to engage in meaningful discussions without shared principles or criteria for evaluating moral claims. The challenges in moral discourse posed by moral relativism have implications for moral decision-making. Without shared moral standards, it becomes difficult to make informed ethical choices or resolve moral dilemmas. Critics argue that the absence of objective criteria for evaluating moral judgments can lead to moral confusion and a lack of guidance in decision-making processes. Critics of moral relativism raise concerns about the challenges it poses in engaging in meaningful moral discourse. They argue that the absence of shared moral standards and the reluctance to critique moral beliefs can hinder the exploration, evaluation, and improvement of moral frameworks. These challenges have implications for moral decision-making and can lead to moral nihilism and moral indeterminacy. The critique of challenges in moral discourse calls for a consideration of the role of objective moral principles in facilitating productive ethical discussions and the pursuit of moral progress. Ethical universalism is a perspective that contrasts with moral relativism. It asserts the existence of objective moral principles that apply to all individuals, regardless of cultural or individual differences. Ethical universalists argue that moral relativism fails to provide a coherent foundation for moral judgments, as it allows for contradictory moral beliefs without any means of distinguishing between them. Here are some of the points that critics make regarding ethical universalism. Ethical universalism posits that there are objective moral principles that apply universally to all individuals. These principles are not dependent on culture, historical, or individual perspectives, but are grounded in the transcendent moral reality. Ethical universalism offers a framework for evaluating moral progress and advancement. It allows for the assessment of moral beliefs and practices based on objective moral standards. By establishing a shared set of principles, ethical universalism enables the evaluation of moral advancements and condemns moral atrocities, providing a means to distinguish between morally right and wrong actions. Ethical universalism provides an objective basis for engaging in meaningful ethical discussions. It allows for the comparison and evaluation of moral perspectives based on shared principles. Critics of moral relativism argue that without objective standards, moral discourse can become a clash of subjective opinions without a means of resolving moral disagreements or making progress towards moral understanding. Ethical universalism promotes an idea that moral reasoning should be consistent and objective. It emphasizes the importance of logical and rational evaluation of moral arguments and principles. By appealing to objective moral truths, ethical universalism encourages individuals to critically examine their moral beliefs and to engage in coherent moral reasoning. Ethical universalism underpins the concept of human rights, asserting that certain fundamental rights are inherent to all human beings. It provides a basis for universal principles such as respect for human dignity, fairness, justice, and compassion. Critics argue that moral relativism may struggle to provide a consistent and compelling foundation for the recognition and protection of human rights. Critics of moral relativism advocate for ethical universalism, emphasizing the need for objective moral principles in a coherent foundation for moral judgments and ethical discussions. Ethical universalism provides a framework for evaluating moral progress, engaging in rational moral reasoning, and recognizing universal human rights. It offers a counterpoint to moral relativism, emphasizing the importance of objective standards in guiding ethical decision-making and promoting a more just and morally coherent society. The debate between proponents and critics of moral relativism continue to shape the discussions on morality and ethics. It's important to critically analyze these arguments and consider their implications for our understanding of morality. Understanding the diverse viewpoints surrounding moral relativism allows us to engage in thoughtful discourse, refining our own moral reasoning and contributing to the ongoing exploration of ethical frameworks. Critics of moral relativism often argue that it is self-refuting, meaning that the position undermines its own validity or coherence. They contend that moral relativism fails to provide a logically consistent framework for evaluating moral judgments. Here are some of the points that critics make regarding the self-refuting nature of moral relativism. Critics of moral relativism often point out what they perceive as contradictory claims within the framework. They argue that moral relativism, by asserting that all moral perspectives are equally valid and that there are no universal moral standards, seems to make an absolute claim about the nature of morality itself. This self-referential inconsistency challenges the coherence of moral relativism. Here are some of the key points regarding contradictory claims within moral relativism. Moral relativism asserts that all moral perspectives are equally valid. It suggests that there is no objective or universal standard against which moral judgments can be measured. However, critics argue that this claim itself seems to make an absolute statement about the nature of morality, essentially asserting that the belief in moral relativism is superior or more valid than non-relativistic perspectives. This self-referential contradiction undermines the consistency of moral relativism. By positing that all moral perspectives are equally valid, moral relativism encounters a challenge in providing grounds for evaluating moral judgments. If all moral beliefs are equally acceptable, there is no principled basis for distinguishing between moral claims or asserting their validity. Critics argue that without a framework for evaluating moral judgments, moral relativism struggles to provide a coherent and consistent method for reasoning about morality. The claim that all moral perspectives are relative to specific cultures or individuals implies a universal principle of relativism. This raises a contradiction within moral relativism. If relativism is universal and applies to all moral judgments, it creates a standard that goes beyond mere recognition of cultural or individual variation. Critics contend that this contradiction undermines the coherence of moral relativism. The existence of contradictory claims within moral relativism leads critics to question the logical consistency and coherence of the framework. The assertion of equality without a basis for evaluation and the paradoxical nature of relativism itself create tensions within the moral relativistic position. These contradictions raise important questions about the viability of moral relativism as a logically coherent and internally consistent moral theory. It's important to note that defenders of moral relativism may provide counterarguments to address these criticisms. They might argue that the claims made by moral relativism are not absolute, but rather highlight the diversity and complexity of moral perspectives. The debate surrounding the contradictory claims within moral relativism continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. One of the central challenges within moral relativism is the paradox of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism, a form of moral relativism, argues moral judgments are relative to specific cultural contexts. However, this claim presents a paradox when examined more closely. Critics argue that the assertion that all moral judgments are relative becomes self-contradictory when applied universally. Here are some key points regarding the paradox of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism suggests moral judgments are relative to specific cultures, and no culture's moral beliefs can be deemed superior or inferior to another's. However, this stance creates a predicament. If moral relativism demands that we refrain from criticizing other cultures' practices, it would also require us to withhold criticism when a culture engages in morally objectionable actions, such as human rights violations or acts of cruelty. Critics contend that this unwillingness to condemn certain actions contradicts our moral intuitions and the universal desire for justice and human well-being. Cultural relativism often emphasizes cultural diversity and the importance of respecting different moral perspectives. However, critics argue that this focus on diversity raises questions about moral progress. If all moral perspectives are equally valid, it becomes challenging to evaluate moral advancement or condemn moral atrocities. The absence of a shared standard for moral progress undermines the idea of moral improvement over time and inhibits the ability to address instances of widespread moral wrongdoing. The paradox of cultural relativism also emerges in the claim's universal application. If all moral judgments are deemed relative to specific cultural contexts, then relativism itself becomes a universal moral principle. Critics argue that this contradicts the very essence of relativism, as it establishes an overarching principle that goes beyond recognizing cultural variation. This inconsistency challenges the coherence of cultural relativism within the moral relativistic framework. The paradox of cultural relativism raises significant concerns regarding the logical consistency of moral relativism. The tension between refraining from moral criticism, the challenge of moral progress evaluation, and the contradiction within the universal application of relativism itself highlight the complexities within cultural relativism. These paradoxes prompt critics to question the coherence and viability of moral relativism as a comprehensive moral theory. It's important to note that defenders of moral relativism may provide counter-arguments to address these criticisms. They might argue that cultural relativism is not meant to condone or justify all cultural practices, but rather to encourage understanding and empathy. They may also emphasize the need for nuanced evaluations of specific cultural contexts when addressing moral issues. The debate surrounding the paradox of cultural relativism continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Moral relativism faces challenges in providing logical grounds for moral disagreements. If moral judgments are entirely subjective and relative, without any objective standard to appeal to, it becomes difficult to engage in meaningful discussions or resolve moral conflicts. Here are some of the key points regarding the absence of logical grounds for disagreement within moral relativism. Critics argue that moral relativism struggles to provide a logical basis for asserting conflicting moral claims. If all moral judgments are subjective and relative, without any external reference point, it becomes challenging to determine the validity or superiority of one moral judgment over another. Without logical grounds for disagreement, moral relative can lead to a relativistic stance that views all moral perspectives as equally valid, inhibiting the possibility for constructive ethical discourse. The absence of objective standards in moral relativism poses challenges in evaluating the moral worth of actions or beliefs. Without shared criteria for asserting moral claims, it becomes challenging to make reasoned judgments or to distinguish between morally justifiable or morally objectionable actions. Critics contend that the lack of logical grounds for evaluation within moral relativism undermines its ability to provide a coherent framework for moral reasoning and analysis. Critics also raise concerns about the limited potential for moral progress within moral relativism. Without objective standards to guide moral development, it becomes difficult to ascertain whether societies or individuals are advancing morally or regressing ethically. The absence of logical grounds for disagreement can hinder the identification and rectification of moral shortcomings, potentially inhibiting the pursuit of a more just and morally enlightened society. The absence of logical grounds for disagreement affect the quality and effectiveness of moral discourse. If all moral judgments are seen as equally valid, it becomes challenging to engage in meaningful debate or resolve moral conflicts through rational discourse. Critics argue that the absence of logical grounds for disagreement can lead to a breakdown in communication and hinder the pursuit of shared moral understanding. The absence of logical grounds for disagreement within moral relativism raises concerns about its coherence and practicality as a comprehensive moral theory. The subjective and arbitrary nature of claims, the difficulty in moral evaluation, the limited potential for moral progress, and the implications for moral discourse prompt critics to question the ability of moral relativism to provide a robust framework for ethical reasoning and decision-making. It's important to note that defenders of moral relativism may provide counterarguments to address these criticisms. They might argue that moral relativism allows for the recognition and appreciation of diverse moral perspectives without denying the possibility of rational discourse and ethical evaluations within specific or individual contexts. The debate surrounding the absence of logical grounds for disagreement continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Critics of moral relativism argue that it makes a prescriptive claim about how individuals ought to approach morality. By asserting that all moral perspectives are equally valid, moral relativism implies that individuals should accept and tolerate all moral viewpoints without critique or evaluation. However, this prescriptive claim contradicts the relativistic stance itself, as it suggests that individuals ought to adhere to specific moral principles. Here are some key points regarding moral relativism as a prescriptive claim. Moral relativism implies that individuals should refrain from making moral judgments about others' beliefs or actions. It promotes the idea that all moral perspectives are equally valid and should be respected without criticism or evaluation. Critics argue that this expectation of non-judgment contradicts the reality of human moral reasoning, which naturally involves evaluating, critiquing, and making judgments about moral beliefs and actions. Critics contend that the prescriptive claim of moral relativism can hinder moral improvement. If all moral perspectives are deemed equally valid and beyond critique, it becomes challenging to identify and address moral shortcomings or promote ethical grounds. The expectation to accept and tolerate all moral viewpoints without evaluation may inhibit the pursuit of moral progress and the recognition of moral improvements as a desirable goal. The prescriptive claim of moral relativism raises questions about its own coherence. Critics argue that if relativism asserts that individuals ought to accept and tolerate all moral perspectives, it contradicts the core tenet of relativism, which denies the existence of objective moral standards. The prescription to accept relativism itself seems to assume an objective moral principle that individuals should adhere to, undermining the relativistic stance. Critics also raise concerns about the implications of moral relativism for moral responsibility. If moral judgments are entirely subjective and relative, it becomes challenging to hold individuals or cultures accountable for their moral actions. The prescriptive claim of moral relativism may undermine the concept of moral responsibility, as it suggests that individuals should not be held accountable for their moral choices, or that all actions are equally morally valid. The prescriptive claim of moral relativism raises significant questions about its coherence and practicality as a comprehensive moral theory. The expectation of non-judgment, challenges to moral improvement, the coherence of relativism itself, and the implications for moral responsibility prompt critics to question the ability of moral relativism to provide a robust and internally consistent framework for ethical reasoning and decision-making. It's important to note that defenders of moral relativism may provide counterarguments to address these criticisms. They might argue that moral relativism's prescriptive claim is not meant to discourage ethical reflection or improvement, but rather to encourage tolerance, understanding, and recognition of the complexity of moral issues. They may emphasize the importance of cultural humility and respect for different moral perspectives. The debate surrounding moral relativism as a prescriptive claim continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Critics argue that the self-refuting nature of moral relativism challenges its logical consistency. The contradictory claims, the paradox of cultural relativism, the absence of logical grounds for disagreement, and the prescriptive nature of moral relativism create tensions within the framework. These inconsistencies raise questions about the viability of moral relativism as a logically coherent position. It's important to note that defenders of moral relativism may provide counterarguments to address these claims. They might argue that claims made by moral relativists are more nuanced and do not lead to self-contradiction. The debate surrounding the logical consistency of moral relativism continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Moral relativism is often criticized for its perceived lack of coherence in its moral reasoning. Critics argue that without objective moral standards, moral relativism struggles to provide a consistent and compelling framework for evaluating moral judgments. Here are some points that critics make regarding the coherence of moral reasoning within moral relativism. Critics argue that it faces challenges in consistently evaluating moral claims. If all moral judgments are considered subjective and relative, without an objective standard to appeal to, it becomes difficult to determine the validity or superiority of one moral judgment over another. This lack of consistency in evaluating moral claims raises concerns about the coherence of moral relativism. Here are some key points regarding the inconsistency in evaluating moral claims within moral relativism. Moral relativism asserts that all moral perspectives are equally valid, implying that there is no universal or objective standard by which to evaluate moral judgments. However, critics argue that this relativistic stance creates an inherent inconsistency in evaluating moral claims. Without an external reference point or shared criteria for evaluation, it becomes challenging to determine the logical coherence, moral worth, or superiority of one moral judgment over another. Critics contend that the absence of an objective standard in moral relativism results in arbitrary and subjective evaluation of moral claims. The lack of logical grounds for distinguishing between conflicting moral viewpoints can lead to inconsistent or ad hoc evaluations based on personal preference or cultural bias. This subjectivity in evaluating moral claims undermines the ability to make reasoned and consistent moral judgments. The inconsistency in evaluating moral claims within moral relativism poses challenges in resolving moral disagreements. Without shared criteria for an objective basis for evaluating conflicting moral viewpoints, it becomes difficult to reach a resolution or consensus. Critics argue that this inconsistency hinders the potential for meaningful moral discourse and inhibits the ability to address moral conflicts or to make progress towards moral understanding. The inconsistency in evaluating moral claims within moral relativism raises questions about the concept of moral progress. Without an objective standard against which to measure moral advancements or improvements, it becomes challenging to identify or evaluate moral growth over time. Critics argue that the lack of consistency in evaluating moral claims limits the ability to recognize and pursue moral progress, potentially hindering the development of a more just and morally enlightened society. The inconsistency in evaluating moral claims within moral relativism raises significant concerns about its coherence and practicality as a comprehensive moral theory. The relativistic stance, the arbitrary and subjective nature of evaluation, the difficulty in resolving moral disagreements, and the implications for moral progress prompt critics to question the ability of moral relativism to provide a robust and consistent framework for ethical reasoning and decision-making. It's important to note that defenders of moral relativism may provide counterarguments to address these criticisms. They might argue that moral relativism allows for a contextual and nuanced understanding of morality without denying the possibility of rational discourse and ethical evaluation within specific cultural or individual contexts. They may emphasize the importance of considering diverse perspectives and engaging in dialogue to enrich a moral understanding. The debate surrounding the inconsistency in evaluating moral claims continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. One of the challenges that moral relativism faces is the difficulty in resolving moral disagreements. Without shared criteria, or an objective basis for evaluating conflicting viewpoints, it becomes challenging to reach a resolution or consensus. This difficulty in resolving moral disagreements raises concerns about the coherence and practicality of moral relativism. Here are some of the key points regarding the difficulty in resolving moral disagreements within moral relativism. Moral relativism posits that moral judgments are subjective and relative to specific cultures or individuals. This relativistic nature of moral claims makes it challenging to find common ground for resolving moral disagreements. If all moral perspectives are deemed equally valid, it becomes difficult to determine how conflicting moral viewpoints can be evaluated or reconciled. Critics argue that moral relativism lacks an objective standard by which to evaluate conflicting moral claims. Without a shared framework or external reference point, it becomes challenging to determine which moral claim is more reasonable, morally justified, or ethically preferable. The absence of an objective standard hinders the resolution of moral disagreements and inhibits the ability to reach a consensus on ethical matters. Moral relativism recognizes the cultural and individual variation in moral judgments. However, this recognition further complicates the resolution of moral disagreements. With diverse cultural norms and individual perspectives, finding a common ground or shared understanding becomes increasingly difficult. Critics argue that moral relativism's emphasis on diversity may hinder the exploration of common moral values or the ability to address moral conflicts effectively. Moral disagreements can vary in scope and range, from interpersonal conflicts to broader societal debates. Critics contend that moral relativism struggles to provide a coherent approach for resolving disagreements across different scales. The absence of a consistent evaluative framework limits the effectiveness of moral relativism in addressing moral conflicts and making progress towards moral understanding. The difficulty in resolving disagreements has implications for ethical decision-making. Without a shared framework or objective basis, it becomes challenging to make informed ethical decisions or navigate complex moral dilemmas. Critics argue that the lack of a coherent approach to resolving moral disagreements undermines the practicality and effectiveness of moral relativism as a moral theory. The difficulty in resolving moral disagreements within moral relativism raises significant concerns about its coherence and practicality as a comprehensive moral framework. The relativistic nature of moral claims, the absence of an objective standard, the challenges posed by cultural and individual variations, and the implications for ethical decision-making prompt critics to question the ability of moral relativism to provide a robust and effective approach for resolving moral conflicts. It's important to note that defenders may provide counterarguments. They might argue that moral relativism allows for the recognition and appreciation of diverse moral perspectives, while emphasizing the importance of engaging in dialogue, empathy, and mutual understanding to address moral disagreements. They may highlight the value of moral humility and the potential for moral growth through respectful discourse. The debate surrounding the difficulty in resolving moral disagreements continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Critics of moral relativism raise concerns about the implications of moral relativism for moral responsibility. If moral judgments are entirely subjective and relative, it becomes challenging to hold individuals and cultures accountable for their moral actions. The nature of moral relativism can impact the concept of moral responsibility in several ways. Here are some key points regarding moral relativism and moral responsibility. Moral relativism asserts that moral judgments are subjective and relative, lacking an objective standard against which moral actions can be evaluated. Critics argue that this subjectivity and absence of objective standards can undermine the concept of moral responsibility. If all moral perspectives are equally valid, it becomes difficult to hold individuals accountable for their actions or to make meaningful moral judgments about their behavior. Cultural relativism emphasizes the importance of respecting different cultural norms and moral perspectives. Critics argue that this emphasis on cultural relativism may hinder the ability to critique or condemn morally objectionable actions. If moral relativism demands non-judgment and equal acceptance of all moral perspectives, it becomes challenging to address moral wrongdoing or hold individuals accountable for their actions. The absence of objective standards in moral relativism presents challenges in evaluating moral wrongdoing. Without a shared evaluative framework, it becomes difficult to determine the moral status of certain actions or behaviors. Critics argue that this can lead to a morally relativistic stance where actions that are widely considered morally wrong, such as acts of violence or discrimination, are viewed as merely relative to specific cultural or individual perspectives, thereby undermining the concept of moral responsibility. Critics contend that moral relativism's rejection of objective moral standards can hinder moral growth and improvement. The absence of a shared moral framework for evaluation may limit the ability to recognize and rectify moral shortcomings. Without a coherent basis for addressing moral actions, moral relativism may undermine the motivation to strive for moral progress and hinder the development of a more just and morally enlightened society. The implications of moral relativism for moral responsibility are complex and raise significant concerns about its coherence and practicality as a comprehensive moral theory. The subjectivity and absence of moral standards, the challenges in evaluating moral wrongdoing, the potential hindrance to moral growth and improvement, and the impact of cultural relativism on moral criticism prompts critics to question the ability of moral relativism to provide a robust and meaningful understanding of moral responsibility. Defenders of moral relativism might argue that it allows for the recognition of cultural diversity and the importance of empathy, understanding, and dialogue in addressing moral responsibility. They may emphasize the need for context-specific evaluations and the potential for moral growth through critical self-reflection. The debate surrounding moral relativism and moral responsibility continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Critics of moral relativism argue that it faces epistemic challenges, meaning challenges related to knowledge and justification, as it struggles to provide a basis for justified moral beliefs. If all moral perspectives are deemed equally valid and there are no objective standards for evaluating moral judgments, moral relativism may encounter difficulties in providing a coherent epistemic framework for moral reasoning. Here are some of the key points regarding the epistemic challenges faced by moral relativism. Moral relativism's rejection of objective moral standards raises questions about the epistemic justification of moral beliefs. If all moral perspectives are equally valid, it becomes challenging to provide rational and coherent justifications for specific moral claims. Critics argue that moral relativism's lack of objective grounds for moral beliefs weakens its ability to offer a reliable and intellectually rigorous foundation for ethical reasoning. Without objective standards to guide moral evaluation, moral relativism may struggle to provide a rational basis for assessing the validity of moral claims. The absence of shared criteria for evaluating moral judgments can lead to a breakdown in logical reasoning and critical analysis. Critics contend that the epistemic challenges faced by moral relativism undermine its capacity to engage in intellectually rigorous moral discussion and evaluation. The epistemic challenges within moral relativism can lead to moral skepticism, a position that doubts the possibility of objective moral knowledge. Critics argue that if moral relativism cannot provide a reliable epistemic basis for justified moral beliefs, it may erode confidence in the existence of objective moral truths altogether. The epistemic challenges of moral relativism may lead to a skeptical stance where the very notion of moral knowledge is called into question. The epistemic challenges of moral relativism are further complicated by the lack of consensus on the appropriate criteria for justification. Without shared epistemic principles or objective standards, it becomes difficult to establish a coherent framework for evaluating and justifying moral beliefs. Critics contend that the absence of a consensus on epistemic standards weakens the credibility and reliability of moral relativism as a comprehensive moral theory. The epistemic challenges within moral relativism raise significant concerns about its ability to provide a coherent epistemic foundation for moral reasoning and justification. The difficulties in justifying moral beliefs, the challenges in rational evaluation, the potential for moral skepticism, and the lack of consensus on epistemic standards prompt critics to question the viability of moral relativism as a robust framework for ethical knowledge and understanding. Defenders of moral relativism might argue that it allows for contextual and nuanced understanding of morality, which can accommodate diverse moral perspectives. The debate surrounding the coherence of moral reasoning within moral relativism continues to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Moral relativism is a complex and widely debated theory that posits that moral judgments are subjective and relative, varying across cultures and individuals. Throughout this exploration of moral relativism, we have examined its definition, nature, and the various arguments for and against it. While moral relativism offers certain insights and perspectives, it also faces significant criticisms and challenges. Moral relativism highlights the understanding that moral judgments are influenced by cultural, historical, and individual factors. It emphasizes the importance of appreciating diverse moral perspectives and the need for tolerance in a pluralistic society. Additionally, moral relativism recognizes the subjectivity of moral judgments, acknowledging that they are shaped by personal experiences, beliefs, and cultural contexts. However, moral relativism encounters several significant challenges. Critics argue it lacks a coherent framework for evaluating moral claims, as it rejects the existence of objective moral standards. The paradox of cultural relativism, the difficulties in resolving moral disagreements, the challenges in achieving moral progress, and the epistemic challenges it faces raise concerns about its logical consistency, practicality, and ability to provide a robust moral foundation. While moral relativism raises important questions about the nature of morality and the diversity of moral perspectives, it faces criticism regarding its logical coherence, its ability to provide consistent moral evaluations, and its implications for moral responsibility and progress. Tensions within moral relativism prompt ongoing discussion and debate in the field of ethics. Ultimately, the evaluation of multiple relativism rests on individual perspectives and philosophical positions. Some may find moral relativism to be a valuable approach that fosters understanding and tolerance, while others may argue for the importance of objective moral standards and universal ethical principles. It's essential to engage in thoughtful and respectful dialogue considering the strengths and weaknesses of moral relativism, as well as alternative ethical theories, in order to cultivate a more comprehensive understanding of morality and the complexities of human ethics. The exploration of moral relativism and its critiques invites us to reflect on the nature of moral judgments, the role of cultural diversity, the possibility of moral progress, and the foundations of moral responsibility. By engaging in these discussions, we can deepen our understanding of ethics and contribute to an ongoing discourse on how to best navigate the complex landscape of moral decision-making in our diverse and interconnected world. The absence of a universal agreed-upon concept of concrete right or wrong is one of the central tenets of moral relativism. However, it's important to understand that the absence of concrete, objective moral standards does not necessarily mean that the concept of morality becomes neutered or devoid of meaning. Moral relativism acknowledges that moral judgments are influenced by subjective factors such as cultural norms, personal beliefs, and individual experiences. It recognizes that different societies, cultures, and individuals may hold diverse moral perspectives and standards. From a relativistic standpoint, moral judgments are relative to these specific contexts and cannot be universally imposed. While moral relativism challenges the notion of objective moral truths, it does not negate the importance of personal value, ethical considerations, or the potential for moral reasoning and evaluation. Within the framework of moral relativism, individuals can still engage in meaningful discussions about ethics, make personal moral choices, and evaluate the moral implications of their actions based on their own value and the values of their respective communities. Furthermore, moral relativism does not advocate for a complete moral nihilism or an abandonment of all moral principles. It recognizes that individuals and societies have developed certain moral frameworks and norms that guide their behavior. These frameworks may differ across cultures, but they still play a significant role in shaping moral judgments and social interactions. While moral relativism challenges the idea of a single objective moral standard, it does not eliminate the possibility of moral deliberation, ethical reasoning, or the pursuit of moral progress. It encourages individuals to engage in dialogue, empathy, and mutual understanding to navigate the complexities of morality and foster tolerance in a diverse world. It's important to note the concept of moral relativism is not universally accepted, and there are other ethical theories that propose alternative approaches to understanding morality, such as ethical universalism. The debates surrounding moral relativism versus other moral theories continue to shape discussions on the nature of morality and the evaluation of moral judgments. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. This is the point at which others tell you, if you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel for more content just like this. But we know that kind of thing is for losers. Don't be a loser. And as always, I welcome your feedback and ideas for future videos in the comments section below. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep embracing your inner nude, dude. And once again, thanks to Frodo Jr. MLG 653 for the idea for this video.